Okay, 1302, let's do it up. First exam, chapter 16 through 18. We're going to do a deconstruct here. What you're basically looking at is pretty much the same thing what we've been working on in the past. You're looking at 3 questions, 3 chapters, 1 question per chapter. Ideally, what you want to do is write 10 to 12 sentences using key terms, generalizations, names, dates, numbers, the whole 9 yards. So let's take a look at that first question. Now, this first question asks, what factors combined to make the United States a mature industrial society after the Civil War? So the first thing you want to do is isolate that, factors. So what you're going to basically look at is 1865 through 1900. You want to give it a date. Now what you want to do is isolate on the factors. So you do industry, communication, transportation, immigration, and natural resources. And what you're going to do is you're going to talk about all of these, all right? Discuss each. All right, talk about them. Now, with this maturity, what you want to do is link that the United States is now in competition with Great Britain, France, and Germany. And the United States isn't quite there yet, but they're getting there. All right. So like I said, you got the when, you got the what, a little bit of a who, and then finish it off by, again, going through all of these. Tell me how these all came together to make us an industrial society. All right. So I would have to say, if you're going to focus on region of the country, industry in the Northeast, Midwest and West, you're going to talk about railroads, agriculture, and then, of course, when you talk about the South, you can talk about agriculture, but you also just want to allude to the fact that they're still kind of stuck in the past, all right? And that's going to be crucial because that's really the only one thing that's going to hold up this mature industrial society. So again, time, discuss these factors, where, and then kind of the consequences of it all. Now, one thing I really want you guys to get in the habit of doing is if you're going to talk about something, always talk about the positives and then tell me the downside. I definitely want to see that evolving in your answers, is tell me what the positives of all this is, but then also lead to the negatives. And in the course of doing that, what you can do is you can talk just briefly about the robber barons and, of course, the gap between the rich and the poor. All right. So that pretty much takes you through that first question for chapter 16. Now, with regards to the West transformation economically and socially in this period, what you want to do is you want to talk about how the natives continue to pay the price, right? Their lands were taken. Bison obviously wiped out. Here we have the expansion of the railroad, and that leads to hubs, new markets, towns, growth, industries of mining, ranching, agriculture, right? You can talk about immigrants, largely German and Irish coming this way. You can also talk about the Chinese, in the building of the railroads. Okay. And again, just economically and socially, you're just going to talk about all these things right here. Plenty to talk about. One thing you want to end this with is talk briefly about Frederick Jackson Turner's closing of the frontier. All right. And that is in many ways is a metaphor for the American dream and the idea that um, um, here, let's fix this. It's a metaphor for the American dream kind of disappearing, and this notion that the American individual ruggedness will be rewarded. He's, like I said, he's doubting this, right? He's doubting that the American dream still exists, and he's also doubting that the individual and ruggedness that came to be a part of American society, or that metaphorical sense of it all, that it's still there, all right? And again, he's saying it's disappearing. Little autofocus there. All right, let's take a look at the next one. Now, the Gilded Age, and here we have it, is a political system with regards to meeting its goals. Now, here, again, you're talking the Gilded Age, so give me some dates. All right. You're talking about politics. All right. You're talking about Republicans and Democrats. And now what they're going to do is it's all about power, and it's all about money. So what you're going to do is tell me about power and money and how it relates to politics. And we've discussed this in earnest in class, so we talk about it quite a bit. So it's not anything new. What I want you to do is just frame it into some sentences. Now, talk about party machines. And this is key because these party machines is what keeps power and money in the hands of politicians. And here, what you can do is you can talk about Tammany Hall and Boss Tweed. And remember the story that I talked about, immigrants and how they exploited the immigrants, right? Jobs, healthcare, housing, right? And how they traded those things for votes, right? The poor Irish guy comes off the boat, doesn't have a job, doesn't have medical care, doesn't have housing, and he's willing to trade that, right? Now, as far as meeting its goals, let's just say it was a mixed bag in the sense that it worked, but it worked as long as the spoils system was intact, all right? As long as this system was intact, they had power, right? They can exchange jobs for money and votes and such, right? The only thing that's going to happen is the reformers are going to come in and attack this, all right? And what they want is jobs to be doled out not to loyalty, but based on merit, all right? And that's where you get those federal tests, all right? So again, talk about all this. Talk about cause and effect, action, reaction. And again, at the end, always end it by telling me what the positive and negatives are for both of those. If you need a little clarity, you can always go back to your notes, and then, of course, take a look at the textbook as well. All right, so let's move to number 4. Now, here what you have is what factors accounted for immigration become a global phenomenon during the late 19th century, and what kind of communities did the immigrants create in America? So let's break this up first. So in this first part, what you're going to do is you're going to talk about who came, why they came, where they landed, and then tell me just a little bit about what the consequences of their landing is. All right, so here you're going to talk about the Irish, Germans, Central Europeans, Southern Europeans. They're going to come in mass, and they're going to come in the millions. All right. Now, why did they come? Now, they came because they wanted economic prosperity. They wanted to get rid of religious persecution. Culturally, they sought out some of their own, right? And then the last part of this is going to be civil strife. Many of them were leaving places that were having war or civil strife, and they were avoiding the draft. All right, so jobs, religious persecution, seeking members of their own society, and civil strife in the old world. Right, again, this isn't civil strife in America. This is civil strife back where they're at. They're trying to avoid war, and they're also trying to avoid draft. And one of the things you want to communicate with this answer is the fact with the who, many of them are young males, 18 to 25, and they're single. All right. Now, that's not to say you're not going to get some family migration, because you will, but the bulk of these are going to be young men. All right, so let's talk about where they end up. They end up in the industrial Northeast, working in factories. They end up in the Midwest, agriculture. They also end up in the West in agriculture, but they're also going to be a part of the railroads. They're going to be building the railroads, right? Now, these ones that end up in the Midwest and the West are largely families that came whole, right? And there's some success. And here, this Midwest and West, you're largely talking about German and some Irish. Here in the Northeast, the industrial Northeast, working in the factories, it would be all these groups. And one thing to consider here, you also want to add in the Chinese and the Mexicans as well. All right, and they're largely railroad and agriculture. Now, let's just talk about the what. All right, they are going to build ethnic enclaves. All right, and that's just where like cultured people all come together and they land in one spot, right? In some cases, they'll end up in ghettos. They'll have ethnic newspapers, ethnic language, guilds, banks, and businesses. Now, I didn't talk too much about guilds before, but what that is just the trades. In other words, a Polish plumber knows another Polish plumber. They get together. They get a group of Polish plumbers together. They establish a guild. So whenever they do something as a group, they do it in critical mass. All right, trying to protect themselves. Now, again, with this second part, this what kinds of communities that immigrants create, this is it right here. This is the second part. This is B, and then this first one is A. So these are the two big sections that you're going to talk about. Don't limit yourself to 2 paragraphs. You can go to 3 paragraphs. Now, one thing that I really want to impress upon you is when you go to conclude this answer, don't forget the Navitas backlash. And this is key because what you want to talk about is xenophobia and the things that these guys did because they felt that this critical mass was un-American. All right. So there you have it. Like I said, you could literally talk about 3 major things in this answer and go to town. All right. So that takes care of that one right there. All right. So let's turn our attentions to the next chapter. Okay. Okay. Populism. The first thing you want to talk about is your origins, and then you want to talk about significance. So let's talk about origins first. What you want here is farmer unrest, government not helping, right? You also want to identify the Grange, Southern Farmers Alliance, and the Populist Party. And this populism has to coincide with you at least acknowledging the Southern Farmers Alliance and the Grange, because essentially they're all going to end up asking for the same thing. Now, the only thing with this Populist Party is it's the same thing with all 3 of these. These are grassroots organizations, all right? They all want the same thing. Fair railroad rates and prices, insurance prices, staples, and fair market prices. In other words, when they take their stuff to market, they deserve to get the same, a decent price for their product. All right. So here this is your first part. Then you want to break this up and give me the significance. In other words, yeah, this is all the stuff. This is why they did it. But at the end of the day, this is the end result. Oh, and real quick, with this farmers' unrest, it was largely Midwestern and Western farmers. And the places you want to focus on are Kansas and Texas. Now, what's the significant? Ideas of populism will spread to the suffrage movement, and socialism to some degree. It was the spread of socialism. What you also going to have is politicians are going to be awakened. And this is key because now what they're seeing is, yeah, this populism should be taken for what it's worth. There is suffering. We need to fix it. But these politicians are awakened because now there's a chance that there's a third party. And this third party could challenge the status quo. And that's something that you definitely want to convey in your answer, is the status quo is now under attack. All right. And of course, you could talk about numbers. Now, with this populism, don't forget to give me some dates. 1880s to roughly to 1916s for all practical purposes. All right. And you can talk about just some people with regards to this populism. You can mention Eugene Debs, Williams Jennings Bryant. All right, just to name a few. Just drop some names. Tell me who the populist candidates were. All right. Now, this next one, pretty much the same thing. What I would suggest you do, since I don't frame two questions here, I would encourage you to almost right away just make sure that you identify as many things as you can to give yourself a framework to talk about. So, what I would do is isolate this, and this. All right. So, the liberties you want to talk about, you want to talk roughly about what the significance of 1877 is going to be, and this legal segregation. And I would suggest that anytime you get a question that, for the most part, just looks like one question, try to figure out a way to break it up into parts to give yourself something to talk about each of the content of that question. So, like I said, right away, you can talk about liberties. What would they be? Civil rights, economic equality, education, freedom of movement. These are all things that African Americans wanted when the end of the Civil War occurred. So what you're basically going to do is, what did the civil liberties of blacks? Now, with blacks, you want to be specific here, because you're talking about 85% of the blacks living in the South. So you're not only going to tell me what the liberties are, you're going to tell me statistically how many blacks there were and where they were located, right? Now, this is significant because once these weren't realized and the Republican Party pretty much backed away, they're going to end up doing something, all right? They're going to end up saying, either we stay here and put up with this stuff, or we end up moving somewhere else. Now, the significance of 1877, just real briefly, this is the end of Reconstruction. All right. And what happens is the Republican Party balks. In other words, no longer are they going to use money and resources to fight the good fight in the Jim Crow South. All right. And that's significant because here they're seeking all these things. You know the period, 1877. You know what had just ended, who's walking away, what's being taken away, and what is the significance of all this. And it's the Jim Crow South. And that leads you to this stanza right here, because now what you have is Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896. You now have the Jim Crow, which we've talked about that. It's legal separation, and it's violence. It's the White League. It's the KKK. It's the status quo. And it's all about power and money. And at the expense of African Americans that were promised these things because of the 14th and the 15th Amendments, right? And again, this is key. All of this is going to give way to legal segregation, and it's backed up by the Supreme Court in 1896 because of Plessy versus Ferguson. All you have to do is just tell me just briefly about the story of Homer Plessy. He was 1/8 black. He's on a train. He bought a first-class ticket. He's kicked off the train. He's jailed. And how he fights it all the way to the Supreme Court, and then the Supreme Court makes its ruling. Just briefly talk about that. So like I said, with this one, again, you're just breaking it up into pieces and then telling me the story as it relates to it. Okay. All right, so let's move on to the next page. All right, let's nail this one. Now, you're dealing with, again, the United States. You're dealing with industrial power, and now you're going to tell me some dates. So let's talk about, again, you could say what if you looked at this. You're talking about the how. This could be rephrased that would say what factors led the United States to emerge to an imperial power in the 1890s. That's just a different way of looking at it. So how, you're talking about factors. All right. So let's look at this one. You want to talk about its industrial might, right? We can borrow that from that other answer. You can talk about its U.S. Navy improving, and there you can talk about Mahan. Here you can talk about large quantities of cheap labor. All right, and that's key because that's all tied to that industrial might. And with this industrial might, just lead into technology and innovation. All right, and here you can talk about risk and capital. There's just all kinds of stuff that you could just lead to this emergence. All right, now there's going to be another factor here that's going to lend itself to this. And before I leave here, again, just talk about abundance of natural resources. All right, and this is all comes down to the United States taking these things that it had in large numbers and exploiting it. All right, and again, don't forget the rise of the middle class. All right, these are all things: better pay, better jobs, industrial might, technology. All these things are going to allow us to merge. Now, with regards to this imperial power, when you get to this next section, remind us what imperialism, all right? And that is where a country exploits a colony or country for its own gain. All right, and that's key. And that is all going to lend itself to the Spanish American War. All right, it's not like the United States said, oh, let's go start a war. The Spanish, for the most part, had been leading to hostilities in Latin America. The United States wanted to protect its business interests there, and that led to the Spanish American War. All right, and what you're going to end up with at the end of the day, once this war is over, is land acquisition, right? We're going to get Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Philippine Islands. So now we're in concert with these other imperial powers. Now, remember, with this imperialism, Great Britain is imperialistic, France is imperialistic, Germany is imperialistic. All right. All these nations are all imperialistic. Now what we're going to do is we're going to exploit this, and then we're going to become an imperialistic power because now we have all this stuff that we can now exploit or export. Now, remember, with this imperialism, one of the reasons why we did this is because we wanted to protect our business interests in Latin America. The Spanish kind of forced the issue, but the underlying factor in all this is the United States is an industrial power in need of new markets. And that is tied to the fact that production is over 33%. In other words, we need to find new places to sell our stuff because of all this. And we're going to use the pretext of war to not only protect our business interests, but we're going to end up gaining territory. And then as a result of that, we're now going to have to turn around and protect it. And that's where our Navy comes back in. All right. All right, so let's take a look at this next one. What rights did Chinese immigrants and Chinese Americans gain in these years, and what limitations did they experience? Though this one, I would have to argue these rights that, for the most part, were limited, and they're going to stay limited until something comes along that kind of just takes it all away from them. All right. So let's talk about limited rights. They were access to jobs, even though they were menial. They had access to movement. They had access to the courts. In other words, if they had a problem, they could take it to the courts. But again, most of the time, even if they went to the court, they lost because of racism. Access of movement, yes, they could pretty much go wherever they wanted. They did have access to jobs. And again, these were limited rights, but there were also limited gains too. All right, and let's talk a little bit more about these gains. These rights and gains, I talked about this. Let's talk briefly about the enclaves, and they're in San Francisco and LA. And the reason why this is important and we include these enclaves is because, yeah, once these limitations came in effect, they still remained behind. They still lived in these enclaves. And these enclaves, in many cases, were called Chinatowns. All right. And again, what did you get with them? Newspaper, language, guilds, to some extent, crime syndicates, right? We won't spend too much time with that, but they become a presence, and they're going to stay there. And if you go out to the West Coast, any of the major cities, any major urban cities, New York, San Francisco, Chicago, LA, they all have a Chinatown. Now, what you're now going to get is limitations, right? But you're also going to get where their limitations set upon them are also going to lead to restrictions and immigrations for other. So when we start talking about these limitations, what's going to happen is Nabatists are upset because they believe jobs are being taken care of, taken from them, resources, and this is largely on the West Coast. And what's going to happen is they're going to pester Congress to pass the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which basically put the kibosh on freedom of movement and immigration for Asian Americans. Now, this is not only race specific, but again, it's racism institutionalized. In other words, it's a law on the books. And if they could do it to the Chinese, they're going to turn around and go after other minority groups. All right. And this is going to go roughly from the 1800s all the way up to 1924. All right. If you can go after one group, you can go after another. And again, the Nabatists used the argument, jobs were taken, resources were taken, all of that. All right. It's just a bad, the dark blemish on our history. And again, read in the textbook just roughly around this, and you can kind of fill in some stuff if I haven't addressed it here. But I think this does a pretty good job of going through it all. All right. Now, this first one, with regards to the groups, here again, you are doing a couple different things here. You're going to identify and discuss. And then you also want to talk about ideas. So what I would do is ID the groups, tell me about what their ideas are, and then talk about the consequences. And what you can do there is just break it up into 3 groups. All right. Here, you're talking about the populist party. You're talking about socialists. You're talking about labor unions, excuse me. To some degree, you're also going to talk about civil rights, right? Civil rights groups. They're pretty much all the groups that are being talked. Oh, and don't forget suffrage jets. All right. So let's just go through what their ideas are. All right. Here, labor, child labor laws, right? Working conditions, immigration protections, civil rights, and that would be tied to voting, job discrimination, education, all the things that we've been talking about with regards to things that needed to be protected by. Now, that's not to say all these groups embrace them, but they're pretty self-explanatory with regards to, if you look at the groups and what they're going to associate. These are all the main ideas, and you can also throw in there prison reform as well. All right. Suffragettes, voting, civil rights, voting, discrimination in employment. All right. Labor unions, just talk about working conditions, how bad they were, what they were. The socialists are pretty much going to be taking a look at all these. Now, the only thing with the socialists is they're going to have an argument that's much sharper to this over here, and it's going to be anti-capitalism. All right. And that is key because we live in a capitalistic society, and they're going to be hell-bent on ridding us of the ills of capitalism. So you want a little bit of a stronger argument here. And the Populist Party, again, is trying to be the third wheel in the political system. Now, what are the consequences? For the most part, they're somewhat limited, right? Because it deals with power and money. You're going to get activist presidents. They're going to take up the cause of this, and they're going to be Teddy Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson. And you can talk about how Taft, Teddy Roosevelt, and Wilson all address these briefly. And then at the end, what you want to do is talk about how this was all really strong between 1880. Wow, let's rephrase that. Let's 1900. Let's back up here. 1900 to 1916. But what's going to really put the kibosh on all this is World War I. All right. So here we have who's doing it, what they're after, and how the consequences kind of all unfold. And again, you can talk about the presidents and what their ideas were, but at the end of the day, this was a great movement, but it was short-lived, and it was short-lived because the United States threw all its interests into the First World War. All right. This one right here, the second one, to some extent, is kind of a rendition of anything that we've talked about with regards to immigration in chapter 16, 17. Just borrow those ideas. And then just kind of, I'd hate to, I probably it's halfway tempted to take this question out, but I'm not. I'm going to leave it intact. But again, take what we talked about immigration in 16 and 17 and basically morph it into the same argument that you would use in chapter 18. And again, all you really want to talk about is who came, why they came, where they landed, and the consequences of them coming. And with this, what you're looking at is the positive and negative again. Like I said, I'm halfway tempted to take this question out, but there's enough information there that you should be okay if you elect to use it. I would probably incline to say, if you've already answered this in another question, tend to stay away on this one. You'd end up basically repeating yourself. All right. So let's turn the page. All right, let's take a look at it. 2 more to go. All right, so here we have it. Let's take a look at this. Break it up into pieces. You got Fordism, you got American industry, you got consumer society, and then the better for worse. So what I would do is break this up into pieces again. Now, again, just look at what you have and just lay it out into pieces. Now, Fordism is basically Henry Ford transforming the workplace. And what he's going to do is he's going to perfect the assembly line process in the course of making cars, which is key because his assembly line proves to be efficient, productive, and beneficial. All right, so let me go through this again. His assembly line was efficient, productive, and beneficial. And when you say beneficial, it's a moneymaker. Now, something else he's going to do. He is going to double the pay of the worker. In other words, I'm going to reward you for hard work. And in the course of doing all that stuff, there now becomes a high demand for a factory job. And millions of people are going to flock to the north, to Michigan, to get these jobs. So again, this Fordism is all leads to Henry Ford and what he did, why he did it. Now, what you want to do is you once you establish Ford, now what you want to do is talk about the transformation. And now what you get is other industries adopt his ways. All right. And what you're essentially going to do is just tell me what ways were adopted and why. So other industries adopt his ways. What you're going to get is a rise in this rise of standard of living, which means pay goes up. Again, many people are going to flock from the south to the north as a way to better themselves. In other words, the industrial northeast is going to grow because of this. More workers, more productivity, more benefit. Industry is now going to benefit greatly. And when I say other industries, we're just not talking about cars. We're talking about other industries building other products. Now, how does this relate to the consumer? More pay, more stuff to buy, growth of service industries. In other words, you're not just going to sell stuff for purchase. You're not going to just be producing stuff. Now what you need is people to sell the stuff that you're making. All right. So more pay, more stuff to buy, growth of the service industry. And what you're going to get is a little bit of a residual of the industry is now workers are going to demand more time off to enjoy what they're now purchasing. And it's a win-win. Even though you give them time off, you force them to work smarter and harder at work for shorter hours, but then they have more time to go and buy stuff. So it's kind of like these guys are getting more of what they want by giving you time off. And again, this better for worse. Let's just limit ourselves to three things. Rise the standard of living, working conditions for the most part don't necessarily improve. Jobs go up, but then at the same time, workers are unhappy, and that is because their jobs leave them feeling like they're robots. All right, so yeah, my standard of living has gone up. Jobs are more plentiful, but when you really look at my working conditions, they're lousy, and then at the end of the day, I'm unhappy. All right, and then of course you could add there, because of this, there's also more leisure time, which is a little bit of a misnomer. And that's just because more time, work hard, play hard. It's kind of a little bit of what I would call a mixed bag. All right, it's a mixed bag. Okay, one last question. Socialism, a rising factor across the globe in early 20th century. Now, what I would do is break this up into parts. And what you're looking at here is asking you about a rising force of the globe. So you're not going to jump in and start talking about the United States right now. So what you need to do is think back into our discussions about where was socialism taking place. So I would say mention Germany, mention France, mention Great Britain, and also mention Russia. And what it is these countries are starting to take a look at socialism as an alternative to capitalism. And what this is they're seeing the ills of the industrial might of these countries, and within these countries, people are reacting. And a lot of these socialists are workers. And they're also intellectuals as well that see the evil of capitalism. Now, obviously, you would have to define capitalism. And what is that? It's the sale of goods and services for a profit, right? Now, here, this sounds great for the person that's making all the money, but what this capitalism is leading to is a gap between the rich and the poor. And this is the argument that the socialists are going to argue. Look at this capitalistic system. Look how it's not working because of this gap that's being put forth. Now we need government to step in. And that is the essence of socialism, because what's going to happen is socialism is going to say, let, or basically demand, that certain industries be owned by the government. And that's for the benefit of the people. All right. Now, what kind of industries are they talking about? In some cases, it would be communication, transportation, and some light industries. All right. So yeah, this one's a little more complicated, in the sense that we didn't spend a whole lot of time on this, but there's enough there that I've talked about it in chapters 16, 17, and 18, that you should be able to go after this. Now, again, I spent a lot of time in this first part of this question. Now I want to kind of end it up. Now, what you're going to basically end up with is two parts that you need to talk about. How successful was it? All right. I would say when you talk about the success of it, it was limited. All right. It is limited in the sense that we love our stuff. We don't really want the government to get in the middle of our business, so we didn't really take it all that much. It did lead to the rise of unions. It did lead to better working conditions. But at the end of the day, it kind of fell apart, and it fell apart because of the government stepping in and supporting big business at the expense of progressivism. All right. And that kind of lends itself to the bottom part of this. What impact did it have on our nation's view of capitalism? And this is the interesting part. Even though the population saw all this nasty stuff, at the end of the day, they still embraced capitalism. All right. And it's largely due to the fact that Americans don't like to be told what to do. All right. We love our independence. And again, yeah, we see all this stuff. It sounds good, but at the end of the day, capitalism allows us to be independent, and it allows us to get our stuff. And at the end, again, when it all gets down to it, keep the government out of our lives. And that is really the end all be all. And I would have to argue that if you look at socialism today and this idea of progressivism, that argument really hasn't gone anywhere. Okay. Now, plenty of information for you. What I encourage you to do is take a look at all the stuff that we've talked about today with this deconstruct, and gravitate to answers, to questions and answers that resonate with you. All right. Go with the ones that you can feel like, hey, I'm making the connections, and I feel as though I can have a lot to say with it. All right. I hope this helps. Yeah, I hope this helps. I think it really will. All right. I'll see you guys tomorrow.